Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and what I've been doing on this channel is going through Plato's dialogues, and I've been trying to emphasize the continuity of thought that runs through all of them. And with that in mind, today I'm going to look at some of his private correspondences. Many translators call them epistles, which, for those of you who don't know this word, it's just a fancy word for a letter. And there are two in particular that I'm going to be focusing on, as you can see. Today I'm going to look at the second letter. Before I do, though, let me just say a few words about the letters in general. So there are 13 of them in total. And there are some disagreements about the dating. It's not entirely clear, but roughly they're dated between 383 BC and 350 BC. Also, of course, as with many of the dialogues, the authenticity is still being debated. The two that I'm focusing on will be the second letter and the seventh letter. They're the two most famous because they deal with the metaphysics, and again, it deals with the ideas that underlie all of the different dialogues. And so it's important to see what his metaphysics was, and so that's why I'm focusing on these two. There is some debate about the authenticity of these two letters as well, although I think nowadays it is generally agreed that these two letters are authentic. Okay, that in mind, let's go to the letter. So it is addressed to a man named Dionysius II. You can probably guess that his father's name was Dionysius I. He was a tyrant of Syracuse, and Dionysius II took over as tyrant when his father died in 367 BC. Now, he had sent for Plato in 366 BC. He had heard about this famous philosopher in Athens and wanted to meet with him. By all accounts, Plato did visit Syracuse that year. He also made a second visit in 361. That one had some drama attached to it. It's covered in the seventh letter. And Plato was kept there for longer than he wanted to stay, and so he was there for over a year. Now, this letter that we're looking at today is believed to have been written at some point between these two visits. There are references to that first visit, but no references to the drama of the second visit, and so it's believed to be written somewhere in between. Okay, so let's go to the letter itself, and the translation I'm using is from LA Post. So the letter opens with Plato addressing a concern of Dionysius, as apparently the tyrant, very much fitting the stereotype of tyrants. He had very thin skin, and he cared too much about what other people said about him. And apparently he heard some negative things coming back to him that Plato and his friends were saying. Plato said, no, none of that is true. And then he writes this. He says, as for you and me and our mutual relations, the situation is as follows. There is no Greek, you may say, who has not heard of us as individuals. Moreover, our association with one another is generally discussed, and be not deceived, it will continue to be discussed in time to come. For the number of those who have heard of our intercourse corresponds to its closeness and warmth. So a bit diplomatic there at the end. And you see that they're both quite famous, the famous powerful tyrant and the famous philosopher. And so, of course, people are going to talk. So he's saying, don't worry, don't worry. He goes on to say this. It is a natural law that wisdom and great power attract each other. So the great philosopher, the powerful tyrant. They are always pursuing and seeking after each other and coming together. And now he goes on to say this about the way they ought to treat one another and behave towards one another because of the fame and because of all the eyes focused on them. He says, the true philosophy I maintain will be better spoken of if we conduct ourselves well, but if otherwise, the reverse. Indeed, if we were to make this object our concern, we could be engaged in no more pious act, nor in any more impious, if we were to neglect it. So what I see here is the idea that everybody is watching them. If they conduct themselves poorly, then people will say, aha, philosophy is no good. Look at the way these two people behave for all of their highfalutin talk. Look how corrupt they are. And so it would turn people off from philosophy, and that would be impious. However, in converse, if these two were to conduct themselves well and with honor, then that would bring honor to philosophy and it would draw people to it. And wouldn't we all like to live in a world where more people were concerned with wisdom? And so that would be something pious. And now it seems that after Plato had left Syracuse, then Dionysius went on to talk to some other philosophers as well. And maybe he had some questions. He was maybe testing Plato. We're not really clear on what his letter was to Dionysius that Plato is responding to, but it seems something of that nature was going on here, because this is what Plato's writing here. He says, if you have no respect at all for philosophical pursuits, then let them alone. If you have some respect, but you've been taught by someone else, or you've discovered for yourself a better philosophy than mine, then show your esteem for that. But if, however, you prefer my philosophical teaching, then you ought to make me too an object of special esteem. Courageous words, perhaps, to write to a tyrant. But what Plato is saying here is that the teacher, whichever teacher you follow, should be held in esteem. And he goes on to explain this in some little bit of detail, and then he sums it up like this. To put it in a nutshell, if you do homage to me, we both rise in the public's esteem. But if I do homage to you, we both sink. And I think this is easy enough to see, that if you see the great philosopher licking the boots, if you will, of a tyrant, then people will not take him very seriously. They both look bad. Whereas if the tyrant is speaking very highly of wisdom and of a philosopher and a teacher, then they both look good. Okay, now we're going to go on to the metaphysics. Now, it doesn't go into great detail, but what he does give in this letter is something that is quite significant. He says, you say that you are not satisfied with the demonstration of the nature of the first principle. So it is like this. It is in relation to the King of all, and on his account, that everything exists. And that, in fact, is the cause of all that is beautiful. It's a very short statement, but there's quite a bit packed in here. So let's use this little diagram. And no, it's not a blue Christmas tree. What I want to show here is that the first principle of all, or what he calls in this statement here, the King of all, is transcendent over all that exists. It is the cause, if you will, the first cause of all, the first principle of all. And it is on account of this first principle that everything exists. Yet, it is in many places in Plato's dialogues, he makes the point of saying that God is the cause of good things, but not all things. So all that exists includes the intelligible that we call being, and also our world of time and space, which we call becoming. And for those of you who have not already heard me talk about this in past videos, let me just briefly explain here that we call this physical realm the realm of becoming because it's always coming into and going out of existence. Whereas the intelligible realm, that which this world is based on, if you will, it always is. It is beyond time and space. So it is eternal and it's never changing. So we call it being. And when you put all of that together, being plus becoming, you get all that exists. But what we see is that there is a complete unity, if you will, at the top here. And then there's greater differentiation as we move down. And as we move into our physical world, we find greater differentiation. Think of it like a net that's stretching. And the holes get bigger as it stretches. And this is what happens in our physical world in the sense that ignorance and false belief has a way of working its way into the natural progression of the unfolding of reality. So it's perfectly natural for ignorance to work its way into the unfolding of reality. But this first principle is not the cause, if you will, the direct cause of that ignorance. It is the cause of all that is beautiful. It's on this account of this first principle that everything exists. But this first principle is the cause of all that is good and beautiful. Okay, he goes on to say that in relation to a second principle, the second class of things exists, and in relation to a third principle, the third class. And it's based on this that I think Plotinus, who is considered the father of Neoplatonism, he wrote some 500 years after Plato, so well after Plato's lifetime. But he's considered the father of Neoplatonism, and his metaphysical system is based on the idea of three hypostases: the first cause, or the first principle, the intelligible, and soul. And that, I think, comes from this idea right here. Now here the underlining is because the antecedent here, it's not immediately clear what it's referring to. It takes a moment to see it, so I underlined it to make it easier. He says, the mind of man, when it has to do with these principles, it endeavors to gain a knowledge of their qualities. And so fixing its attention, the mind finds attention on the things with which it has itself some affinity. But these efforts, however, are in no case adequate. In regard to the king and the things I mentioned, the other two principles, there's nothing like this, no qualities that the mind has an affinity to. And so we don't know what to do with it. So in metaphysics, when we talk about cause and effect, we see that the cause must come before the effect. In metaphysics, what that means is not about time and space, because we're outside of time. And so coming before means being the conditions that allow something else to be, but it's some way outside of the effect. And if existence is the effect, then the cause technically doesn't exist. Yet, being the cause of existence, we can't say that it doesn't exist. And so we're stuck. We don't know what to do with this. And because of this trepidation, because of these, what he calls here, travails, the soul says, what are these principles like? What do I do with this? This question, thou son of Dionysius and Doris, or rather the travail that this question occasions in the soul, is the cause of all the trouble. And if that not be expelled from a person, then he shall never genuinely find the truth. And so this is the puzzle that we're dealing with. Now this quote is a fun one. He says, you told me in the garden under the laurels that you had thought of all of this yourself, and that it was an original discovery of yours. Probably you had heard it explained by someone, though possibly you might by divine ordering have been impelled of yourself in that direction, in thought that you had a secure hold on the demonstration, and therefore did not fix securely the truth of which you had a glimpse. Okay, so on one level, it's just a kind of a fun quote, because we see Dionysius kind of, again, fitting the stereotype of a tyrant who's not only thin-skinned, but also very proud and pompous, and he claims he thought of this all himself, and oh, it's all very easy, he's got it. There's also something, though, very useful here that we can learn from, so that we don't make the same mistake as Dionysius. Because if we go for just the, what I often call the academic insight or the conceptual insight, yeah, it's easy enough to follow the logic that I used on the last screen talking about cause and effect, and it's, you know, it doesn't exist, it doesn't not exist. It's easy enough to follow that argument and say, okay, now I get it. But what we want to do is go beyond the conceptual insight into the experiential insight. And so now we are treading into the realm of mysticism. And this, I think, makes a lot of academics uncomfortable, and perhaps why some want to call this letter spurious. But that's where we have to go. If you don't get to that level of insight, if you stick with just the conceptual or academic insight, then you have this problem. Instead of remaining fixed, your insight darts to and fro, taking now one form, now another, never getting away from the appearance of things. The truth, though, has no such variability. And then he goes on to say that there are men, and a good number of them too, who have intelligence and memory and they have gained the ability to judge a doctrine after examining it by every possible test. These people who are now old men and have been receiving instruction not less than 30 years, who have just reached the point of saying that what formerly they thought most uncertain now appears to them quite certain and evident, while what seemed most certain then appears now uncertain. So we see here that this is a lifelong journey. This is not like other studies where you simply memorize some facts or maybe connect a few dots and then you're an expert and you can become a teacher. That's not what we're doing. I think, again, this makes some people uncomfortable because they'd like it to be that and they like to think of themselves as experts, but it's a different kind of study. And now here's how he ends the letter. He says that it is impossible for what is written not to be disclosed. That is the reason why I have never written anything about these things, and why there is not and will not be any written work of Plato's own. What are now called his are the work of a Socrates embellished and modernized. Perhaps the most famous line from this entire letter is this one right here. And again, some people take issue with it. They say, how could Plato not write everything that he was thinking? Because, in modern academia, professors want to get tenure and they want to look like knowers. And so they put everything that they've seen, every insight they've had into their books to show what their insights are. But the way a spiritual teacher works is very different. And so it's hard for some academics, I imagine, to understand what Plato did and why he would do it this way. And then the last line is a fun one. It says, read this letter now at once, many times, and burn it. Well, luckily for us, tyrants do not take orders, and this letter was never burned, and so we have it to learn from. So that brings us to the end of the second letter. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Also, there is an email address in the description box below. Also, I always appreciate a thumbs up. It lets other people know that this video is something worth watching. And if you like what you're seeing, please think about subscribing if you don't already. I do put out new videos about once a week. And, if you hit the little bell icon, you will get the notification. Also, think about sharing with your friends so you have someone to talk about this stuff with. Okay, so next week I'm going to go on to the seventh letter, and that's a really good one. That's probably the most famous of Plato's letters, so I do hope you'll join me for that. Thank you very much.